December 15th, 1944. The frozen fields of Belgium stretched endlessly under a pale winter sky, where American armored columns moved through countryside that seemed peaceful but masked the greatest counteroffensive Germany would launch in the West. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, and the ground was hard as concrete beneath a thin layer of fresh snow that crunched under the treads of advancing tanks. Tank Commander Lieutenant James Mitchell of the 3rd Armored Division surveyed the landscape ahead through binoculars that kept fogging despite his efforts to keep them clear, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. He was confident in American steel and firepower, certain that the German forces were finished after months of continuous retreat across France and Belgium. His crew believed they had already won this conflict, that the road to Berlin was merely a formality now, just a matter of time and steady advance through territory the enemy could no longer hold. The Allied newspapers spoke of victory before Christmas, of German collapse and imminent surrender. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood yet was that survival in the coming weeks would depend not on the thickness of their armor, or the power of their guns, or the industrial might of American factories, but on wisdom carried across an ocean by a man who had spent his entire life working soil that never belonged to him. Knowledge born from necessity and hardship in the cotton fields of Mississippi that would prove more valuable than any technical manual or tactical doctrine ever written. The morning began like dozens of others since the breakout from Normandy 6 months earlier. Sergeant Robert Hayes performed his ritual inspection of the medium tank M4A3, the vehicle Americans simply called the Sherman, running his gloved hands along the welded seams and checking the tension of the tracks that stretched around the drive wheels. 23 tons of assembled steel, powered by a Continental radial engine producing 400 horsepower, armed with a 75mm main gun, capable of firing armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Hayes had commanded this same vehicle since the beaches of Normandy, through the nightmare of the hedgerows where every field was a fortress, across the liberated fields of France where grateful civilians threw flowers at passing tanks, and now into the forests along the German frontier where the enemy fought with increasing desperation. His crew consisted of 5 men who had become closer than brothers through shared danger and endless miles of warfare, men who knew each other's habits and fears and strengths better than they knew their own families back home. Private First Class Marcus Webb served as the gunner, a 22-year-old farm boy from South Carolina, whose steady hands and sharp eyes had proven invaluable in countless encounters with enemy armor and fortifications. Webb could identify enemy vehicles by their silhouette from remarkable distances, had memorized the weak points and vulnerable angles of every German tank and assault gun they might encounter. Corporal Danny Sullivan operated the bow machine gun from the hull, an Irish kid from Boston, whose constant stream of jokes and sarcastic comments kept spirits high even during the worst moments of combat, even when exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm them all. Private Jimmy Chen, the driver, had joined them as a replacement after the original driver was severely wounded during the fighting around St. Lo in July. Chen was a Chinese-American from San Francisco, quiet and focused, who had proven to have an almost supernatural ability to navigate the tank through terrain that seemed impassable. And then there was Private Isaac Washington, the loader, whose presence in their crew represented something larger and more complex than any of them fully grasped at the time. Washington had grown up on a sharecropper's farm in Mississippi, one of 8 children born to parents who worked land owned by others, who planted and harvested cotton in soil enriched by generations of labor that built wealth and prosperity for everyone except those who actually performed the backbreaking work. His childhood had been defined by the rhythms of agricultural life, planting season and harvest season, years of good crops and years of drought, the constant struggle to produce enough to satisfy the landowner's demands, while still keeping sufficient food for his own family. He had learned to work before he could read, had developed strength and endurance that came from dawn to dusk labor in fields where the summer heat could kill the unwary. He left that life when the military opened its doors wider during the desperate expansion that followed Pearl Harbor, seeking every able body to fill the massive armies needed to fight across 2 oceans and 4 continents. The military remained segregated in most units, divided by rigid racial barriers that reflected the society that created it. But the desperate need for replacements after the brutal fighting in Normandy and France had begun breaking down some of these barriers out of pure necessity. Washington found himself assigned to Hayes's crew after their previous loader, a kid from Iowa named Tommy Peterson, was killed instantly by artillery fire outside the ruined French town of St. Lô during the grinding battles that followed the invasion. The integration had been tense and awkward at first, filled with suspicion and unspoken concerns. Sullivan had grown up hearing certain things about black soldiers, about their supposed capabilities and reliability, stories passed down in his Boston neighborhood that had shaped his understanding of the world. Mitchell himself had quietly worried whether the crew's hard-won cohesion and trust would survive this change, whether the addition of a Negro soldier would create friction and division that could prove fatal in combat. The military had kept the races separate for reasons, or so everyone had been told, reasons related to morale and unit effectiveness and social realities that no one in command seemed eager to challenge. But Washington proved himself through the most basic currency that mattered in combat: absolute competence and unshakable reliability under fire. He could load the main gun faster than their previous loader, maintaining a rate of fire that gave them critical advantages in close-range engagements, where seconds determined who lived and who burned. He never complained even during the most exhausting days, never faltered when artillery screamed overhead or small arms fire pinged against the hull, and somehow maintained an optimistic outlook even when circumstances seemed darkest and most hopeless. Within weeks, the crew had stopped thinking about Washington's race except in those moments when some outside observer or new replacement made it an issue. Within the small metal world of their Sherman, what mattered was whether you could do your job, whether you kept your head when things went wrong, whether your crew could count on you when everything was falling apart. What none of them knew during those autumn months of steady advance across France and Belgium was that Washington carried knowledge that would prove more valuable than any weapon in their arsenal, more useful than all the firepower and armor that American industry could provide. The German counter-offensive struck on December 16th with overwhelming force and complete surprise, a massive assault that caught Allied forces totally unprepared for its scale and ferocity. 3 entire armies totaling more than 200,000 soldiers crashed through thinly defended American positions in the Ardennes forest, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns that represented the last mobile reserves Germany could scrape together from its shrinking territory. Among those armored vehicles were examples of Germany's most formidable weapons: the heavy tank Mark VI, which the Allies called the Tiger, and the even more massive heavy tank Mark VI-B, known as the King Tiger or Royal Tiger. These machines represented the pinnacle of German engineering and battlefield dominance, the heaviest and most powerful tanks to see widespread combat during the entire conflict. The Tiger mounted an 88mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from distances exceeding 2,000 meters, ranges where American tanks appeared as small targets, that were still well within the German weapon's lethal envelope. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal armor at any practical engagement range, the armor-piercing rounds simply bouncing off or shattering against the hardened steel plates. The weight disparity told its own brutal story: 56 tons for a Tiger versus 23 tons for a Sherman, a difference that reflected fundamentally different design philosophies and manufacturing capabilities. German tank armor measured 100mm thick on the Tiger's front glacis plate, while Sherman frontal armor peaked at just 51mm at its thickest point. These cold numbers translated into a brutal tactical reality that Sherman crews learned within minutes of their first Tiger encounter. German heavy tanks could destroy American medium tanks long before American crews could effectively fight back with any hope of success. The exchange ratio in head-to-head encounters favored the Tigers so heavily that American doctrine explicitly warned against engaging them from the front, recommending instead that Sherman crews seek flanking opportunities or call for air support or tank destroyer units equipped with more powerful guns. Hayes and his crew encountered this harsh reality firsthand on the second day of the offensive. During the chaotic retreat and attempted defense, that followed the German breakthrough. Their unit had been rushed north from reserve positions to help contain the expanding German penetration, moving through snow-covered forests where visibility dropped to mere dozens of meters, and every curve in the road could hide an ambush. They were advancing cautiously along a narrow forest track when the lead tank in their column simply exploded without warning, transformed in an instant from a functioning vehicle carrying 5 living men into a fountain of flame and black smoke that rose into the winter sky. Before anyone in the column could react or even process what had happened, the second tank shared the same fate, hit by a round that penetrated its thin side armor and detonated the ammunition stored in racks along the hull. The entire vehicle seemed to jump into the air from the force of the internal explosion, the turret separating from the hull and tumbling into the snow beside the burning wreck. Hayes screamed orders to his driver to reverse immediately, to get off this death trap of a road and into any available cover, no matter how inadequate. Chen threw the Sherman into reverse gear without hesitation, the engine roaring at maximum power as the tank lurched backward down the narrow track. They made it perhaps 50 meters, maybe a bit more, when a massive impact struck their right track assembly, the entire vehicle shuddering from the tremendous force of the blow. The track shattered completely, steel links breaking and separating, leaving the tank immobile and helpless in the middle of the road. Hayes knew with absolute certainty they were finished, that a disabled tank was a dead tank, that German gunners would fire again within seconds to finish them off. The manual said that crews should abandon disabled vehicles immediately before they became death traps. But the manual had been written by officers who had never experienced the sheer terror of climbing out of a damaged tank while an enemy gunner watched through his sights. But the killing shot never came. The expected final round that would transform their Sherman into a burning tomb never arrived. The German tank crew must have assumed they had destroyed another American vehicle, or perhaps they were engaging other targets from the column, or maybe they were simply conserving ammunition for confirmed outcomes. Hayes did not waste time analyzing their good fortune. He ordered his crew to abandon the vehicle immediately, to bail out through the hatches and run for the tree line before the Germans corrected their mistake. They scrambled out in a desperate rush, expecting at any moment to be cut down by machine gun fire that would kill them before they felt the impact. Mitchell fell in the snow getting out of his cupola, rolled down the tank's sloping side, picked himself up and kept running without looking back. Washington was the last man out, pausing just long enough to grab the canvas bag containing their personal items and documents before following the others into the forest. They survived. They made it to friendly lines after 3 hours of crawling through snow and hiding in the freezing woods, listening to the sounds of combat moving around them as the German advance continued. They were eventually assigned a replacement Sherman from the maintenance depot, a vehicle that had been repaired after taking damage in earlier fighting, bearing scars from previous encounters that no amount of welding could completely hide. But the encounter with the unseen German gun had fundamentally changed how Hayes thought about armored operations and tactical doctrine. The technical specifications he had been taught, the tables showing armor thickness and penetration values, the confident assertions about American industrial superiority that could replace 5 destroyed Shermans for every German heavy tank lost, all of it suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless when you were the crew inside one of those 5 tanks expected to be sacrificed for the greater strategic good. The doctrine that treated individual tanks as expendable resources made sense at headquarters, where staff officers moved markers across maps, but it felt very different when your own survival depended on beating those terrible odds. During the days of desperate fighting and gradual reorganization that followed the initial German breakthrough, Hayes noticed Washington spending his evenings studying the terrain around their positions with unusual intensity and purpose. The private would walk through the snow during the few quiet hours they had, examining the color and texture of different surfaces, comparing how various materials looked under different lighting conditions from dawn through dusk. He would kneel beside stream beds, testing the clay with his fingers, collecting samples in empty ration tins. He studied how snow aged and changed color, how shadows fell across broken ground, how the human eye perceived contrast and movement against complex backgrounds. When Hayes finally approached him and asked what he was doing, Washington's initial answer seemed completely absurd, disconnected from any practical military application. Then Washington said with careful deliberation, as if choosing his words carefully, "I grew up hiding things from people who would take them if they saw them. My family, we had to make do with what we could grow on the little plot they let us keep for ourselves. We learned real quick that if the landowner's overseer saw you had something good, he would find a reason to take it or claim it as part of what you owed. So we got clever about hiding our best crops, about making our little successes invisible to folks who would claim them if they knew they existed." Hayes stared at the private, trying to understand what farming experiences in Mississippi could possibly have to do with tank warfare and survival in the Ardennes forest. Washington continued, speaking slowly and thoughtfully, as if translating concepts from one domain into another. "The thing about hiding," he explained, "is that people see what they expect to see. You show them what fits their idea of what should be there, and they will look right past what is actually there, even if it is sitting in plain sight. On the farm, we would plant our best vegetables in rows that looked weedy and neglected from the road, while keeping neat rows of ordinary crops where folks could see them clearly. The overseer would walk right past the good stuff because it did not look like something worth noticing, did not match his expectation of what a valuable crop should look like. He was looking for neat rows of healthy plants, so we gave him that in places that did not matter, while hiding what actually mattered in plain view disguised as worthless weeds." The private paused to let this sink in, then gestured toward their replacement Sherman, sitting partially concealed behind a damaged building. "That tank," he said simply, "it is the wrong color for this environment. It is dark olive green against white snow and bare trees. A child could spot it from 1,000 meters away, just by the contrast alone. But if we changed its appearance, if we made it look like something that belongs in this landscape naturally, maybe those German crews would not see it so quickly. Maybe we could get close enough that our gun would actually matter, close enough that we would have a fighting chance instead of just being target practice." Hayes felt his initial dismissive reaction shift into something else. Genuine curiosity mixed with desperate hope. They had been taking losses at a rate that was unsustainable, watching good crews die because German guns could reach out and touch them from ranges where return fire was impossible or ineffective. Any edge, any small advantage that might improve their odds of survival, deserved consideration no matter how unconventional the source. He asked Washington directly what exactly he was proposing, what specific technique he had in mind. The private explained patiently that back home on the farm, they would mix different types of mud and clay to create colors that matched whatever background they wanted to blend into. During winter, when the overseer might notice missing vegetables or disturbed snow, they would use lighter colored clay, mixed with ash from fires, to create a pale coating that made dark objects seem to disappear against snow and dead grass. The technique was simple in concept, literally just dirt and water and ash, but the effect was remarkable if you understood the principles of color and contrast and how human vision worked. The eye was drawn to edges and differences, to places where one thing met another thing of a different shade or texture. By blurring those edges, by making the transition gradual instead of sharp, you could make solid objects much harder to see even when they were in plain view. It was not invisibility in any magical sense, but it was effective concealment that could buy crucial seconds of advantage. The idea seemed ridiculous to Hayes at first consideration. The Army had regulations about vehicle markings and official camouflage patterns. There were approved methods and standardized procedures for everything, detailed instructions that supposedly represented the accumulated wisdom of military science and battlefield experience. What Washington was suggesting sounded dangerously like something that might get them court-martialed for defacing government property, for taking unauthorized initiative that violated proper channels. But Hayes kept remembering the feeling of being completely helpless as German guns eliminated their column vehicle by vehicle, kept seeing in his mind the burning tanks and knowing that men were dying inside them. He remembered watching friends burn to death because German tanks could engage them from ranges where American doctrine said they were safe. And he thought about how all that doctrine and all those regulations had not saved any of those crews, had not prevented their deaths, or given them even a fighting chance. Hayes made a decision that surprised himself. He told Washington to demonstrate his idea on a small section of their tank, somewhere inconspicuous, where it would not be immediately obvious to officers or inspectors. If it looked stupid or ineffective, they would wash it off immediately and never speak of it again, treating it as a failed experiment. If it showed any promise whatsoever, any hint that it might actually work, they would consider going further and treating the entire vehicle. Washington gathered materials methodically over the course of several hours. He collected pale clay from a stream bed, digging through snow and frozen earth to reach deposits that had the right color and consistency. He gathered ash from their cooking fires and from the burnt-out buildings that dotted the landscape, collecting the lightest colored samples he could find. He scooped up snow that had been on the ground for several days and was beginning to turn gray with accumulated dirt and debris. He mixed these elements with water until he had a thin paste with the consistency of paint, adjusting the proportions until the color matched the winter landscape they were fighting in. Then he applied it carefully to a section of the Sherman's hull, using his bare hands to spread the mixture evenly across the olive-green metal. The mixture dried quickly in the cold air, leaving a mottled coating that transformed the appearance of the treated section. Where the tank had been a dark, solid shape that drew the eye immediately, the treated section seemed to blur and fade, becoming harder to focus on and less prominent against the surrounding environment. The rest of the crew gathered to examine Washington's work, their reactions ranging from skepticism to surprised approval. Sullivan, who had been the most openly skeptical about having a black soldier in their crew during the initial integration, stared at the treated metal in silence for a long moment. His entire upbringing had taught him certain things about racial capability and natural hierarchy, lessons absorbed from family and community that had shaped his understanding of the world. But combat had a way of stripping away comfortable assumptions and forcing practical assessments based on results rather than theory. He finally said, "Well, I will be genuinely damned. That actually works better than I expected." Chen, the driver who rarely spoke unless he had something important to contribute, asked the practical question of how difficult it would be to coat the entire vehicle using this technique. Washington estimated it would take perhaps 4 hours if everyone helped gather materials and apply the mixture, maybe less if they worked efficiently and divided the tasks. The coating was not permanent. Rain would wash it away gradually, and they would need to reapply it regularly to maintain effectiveness. But the materials were everywhere, absolutely free and abundantly available throughout the combat zone. Clay, ash, snow, water. Things so common and ordinary that no one thought of them as valuable or militarily useful, resources that existed in unlimited supply wherever they operated. Mitchell, when Hayes brought the idea to him later that evening, was deeply skeptical, but also desperate enough to consider anything that might improve their survival odds. The lieutenant had lost too many friends in the past weeks of brutal fighting, had written too many letters to families back home, explaining how their sons or husbands had served with honor and distinction before dying in circumstances that seemed preventable. The official line about American numerical superiority, about how the production advantage meant they could trade tanks at unfavorable ratios and still win through attrition, felt increasingly hollow and cruel when you personally knew the men being sacrificed to achieve those strategic calculations. Mitchell examined the treated section of the Sherman carefully, comparing it to the untreated olive-green surface beside it, judging the difference in visibility from various angles and distances. He finally gave permission to proceed with treating the entire vehicle, with the important caveat that this was completely unofficial, and they would need to remove the coating immediately if higher command raised objections or ordered them to stop. Over the next 2 days, during a precious lull in the fighting, as both sides regrouped and prepared for renewed combat, Washington taught the entire crew his camouflage technique in careful detail. They gathered pale clay from multiple stream beds, learning to identify deposits that had the right color and texture for mixing. They collected ash from every available source, cooking fires, destroyed buildings, burnt-out vehicles, taking the lightest colored samples they could find. They mixed in aged snow that had lost its fresh white color and turned gray with accumulated debris. They learned to adjust proportions to achieve exactly the right shade and consistency, making it match the specific environment where they were operating. They applied the mixture by hand because brushes would have created obvious patterns, coating every exposed surface of the Sherman with patient care. Washington directed them constantly during the application, teaching them to create irregular patterns that looked natural and random, explaining that the human eye was extraordinarily good at detecting patterns and symmetry, so the camouflage needed to avoid anything that looked artificial or man-made. The transformation of their Sherman was genuinely remarkable once the work was complete. From a distance of just 100 meters, which was extremely close range in tank combat, the treated vehicle became significantly harder to see and identify against the winter landscape. The sharp edges and distinctive silhouette that made tanks so visible seemed to soften and blur into the background. The coating was far from perfect. Movement would still give them away instantly, and anyone looking carefully at the right spot could still identify them as a tank. But it bought them crucial seconds of advantage, and in armored combat, where engagements were decided in moments, those seconds could mean the difference between shooting first and being shot first, between destroying an enemy tank and being destroyed by it. News of Washington's camouflage technique spread rapidly through the unit, as other crews saw the results and wanted the same advantage for their own vehicles. Soldiers talked constantly, sharing information and innovations through informal networks that existed completely outside official channels. Other tank crews began experimenting with similar methods, each adapting the basic mixture to match their specific operational environment and personal preferences. Some added different types of earth to create varied tones and more complex patterns. Others incorporated plant material from the area to break up straight lines and add three-dimensional texture to the flat coating. The innovation spread organically from soldier to soldier, crew to crew, unit to unit, without any official approval or formal documentation. Officers generally looked the other way or actively encouraged the practice, recognizing that their men were trying desperately to solve a real survival problem with whatever tools and materials they could find. The technical superiority of German heavy tanks was a fact that no amount of doctrine or official optimism could change, so any tactical adaptation that might level the battlefield even slightly deserved support, or at minimum, unofficial tolerance. The camouflage technique's true test under combat conditions came during a patrol mission in early January, after the German offensive had been contained, but before the situation had stabilized into anything resembling controlled defense. Hayes's crew was part of a small task force ordered to probe German positions and gather intelligence about enemy strength, dispositions, and intentions. They moved carefully through devastated forest, where intense artillery bombardment had reduced ancient trees to splintered stumps and churned the earth into a nightmare landscape of craters and debris. The setting was a hellish mixture of white snow, black earth, and grey wood, conditions that should have been perfect for Washington's camouflage technique to prove its worth or fail completely under the ruthless test of actual combat. They were advancing cautiously along a ridgeline that offered some observation over the valley below when Mitchell, standing in the commander's cupola and scanning constantly with his binoculars, spotted movement that made his blood run cold. He raised his binoculars for a better look and felt a surge of pure fear. 3 Tiger tanks were positioned in a small village in the valley, their massive forms partially concealed by damaged buildings but clearly visible to anyone looking from elevated positions. The German crews were standing outside their vehicles, completely relaxed and confident, apparently conducting maintenance or simply taking a break. They showed no sign of alertness or concern. They had not spotted the American Shermans on the ridge above them. Mitchell immediately understood both the incredible opportunity and the mortal danger of their situation. If they engaged these Tigers from their current position, they would reveal themselves and face return fire from weapons that vastly outranged and outgunned their own. German tankers were veterans who reacted quickly and shot accurately, but if they tried to withdraw, any movement might give them away and leave them vulnerable with their backs turned, presenting their thin rear armor to guns that could penetrate it effortlessly from this range. Yet they had also achieved something that should have been impossible according to all their training and experience. They had gotten within 500 meters of Tiger tanks without being spotted, close enough that the Sherman's 75mm gun could potentially penetrate the Tiger's thinner side armor if they could hit the vulnerable points. This was the exact tactical opportunity that doctrine said was nearly impossible to achieve. the flanking position that American tanks needed to have any real chance against German heavy armor. Mitchell made his decision with remarkable speed and calm, his voice steady on the radio as he coordinated with the other two Shermans in his small unit. They would attack simultaneously, each Sherman targeting a different Tiger, all aiming for the vulnerable side armor, where protection measured only 80 millimeters instead of the frontal 100 millimeters. They would fire on his command, scoring as many hits as possible in the first crucial seconds, then immediately displace to avoid return fire and potential counterattack. The entire engagement would need to last less than 60 seconds from first shot to complete withdrawal, operating at the absolute edge of tactical possibility. Hayes relayed targeting instructions to Webb with terse precision, keeping his voice controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The gunner traversed the turret with agonizing slowness, trying to avoid any sudden movement that might catch the attention of a German observer or crew member. Every motion had to be smooth and gradual, nothing that would create obvious change in the landscape that German eyes might detect, even subconsciously. Webb centered his gun sight on the nearest Tiger's side armor, identifying the specific point where the tracks met the hull, where penetration would have the best chance of causing catastrophic internal damage. At this range of approximately 500 meters, the Sherman's armor-piercing round had a realistic chance of penetration if it struck the thinner side plate at a favorable angle. The mathematics of armor penetration were brutal and unforgiving, but they were not impossible if you had position and surprise. Mitchell's voice came through the radio intercom, steady and clear despite the massive stakes. "On my mark. Take your time. Make the first shot count. 3, 2, 1, fire. 3. Sherman main guns fired simultaneously, the sound enormous and shocking, even though they had known it was coming. The concussion rocking each tank and announcing their presence to every German soldier, within 2,000 meters. Webb's shot struck his target perfectly, the armor-piercing round punching through the Tiger's side armor and detonating something critical inside the vehicle. The German tank lurched violently, immediately losing power, smoke beginning to pour from hatches as the crew scrambled to escape their stricken vehicle. The other two Shermans achieved similar results that exceeded all reasonable hope. One Tiger was clearly disabled with visible damage to its track and suspension. The other had crew members bailing out frantically through the hatches, while smoke poured from somewhere inside. Chen already had the Sherman moving, before Hayes could give the verbal order, throwing the tank into reverse and backing off the exposed ridgeline into the cover of destroyed forest. They relocated approximately 200 meters and went completely still, the crew barely breathing as they waited to see if their survival would last beyond the next few seconds. The camouflage coating hopefully would conceal them once again, now that they had stopped moving, letting them fade back into the winter landscape like ghosts. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness, each second feeling like an hour as they waited for return fire or the sound of German infantry advancing to root them out. Mitchell expected everything to deteriorate into chaos, expected the tactical success to be followed immediately by disaster as superior German forces converged on their position. Nothing happened. The minutes stretched into tens of minutes. The damaged Tigers remained in the village, visible through the bare trees but not moving or firing. No additional German units appeared from surrounding areas. No artillery began falling on the ridge where they had fired from. No infantry came probing through the forest. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Mitchell ordered his small unit to withdraw completely, disengaging before their incredible luck ran out, and someone in the German chain of command organized an effective response. When they returned to friendly lines later that day, Mitchell's after-action report created immediate and intense interest from higher command. The statistics were simply too remarkable to ignore. 3 Tiger tanks engaged and disabled by 3 American Sherman tanks without any American losses or even return fire. The numbers simply did not match the expected exchange ratio that everyone from privates to generals had come to accept as brutal reality. Tigers were supposed to destroy multiple Shermans before being stopped themselves, trading American lives at terrible rates because of their overwhelming technical advantages. Intelligence officers arrived quickly to debrief the crews, trying to understand exactly what had happened and whether it could be replicated deliberately, rather than relying on chance. Mitchell explained Washington's camouflage technique in detail, emphasizing how it had allowed them to approach within effective range without being detected by what should have been alert and experienced German crews. He described the materials and application method, the principle of matching the surrounding environment, the way irregular patterns avoided creating artificial-looking surfaces that drew attention. The intelligence officers examined the treated Shermans surface with obvious skepticism, running their hands over the dried mixture and peering at it from various angles. One captain, who had probably never seen combat, commented dismissively that it looked like the crew had simply gotten their tank filthy, that there was no way simple mud and ash could provide effective concealment against experienced German tank crews who had been fighting for years across multiple theaters. Hayes found himself becoming genuinely angry at the dismissive tone and attitude, his carefully maintained military courtesy slipping. He had been fighting continuously since Normandy, had seen more combat and death than most of these comfortable staff officers would experience in their entire military careers. He knew what worked under actual battlefield conditions and what did not, knew the difference between theory and reality. Washington's technique worked. The proof was not theoretical or speculative. It was 3 disabled German heavy tanks and an American crew that had survived an encounter that should have been immediately fatal according to all existing doctrine and statistical analysis. The debate became moot when word of the technique and the successful engagement reached General Omar Bradley's headquarters at 12th Army Group. Bradley, commanding the enormous American force fighting across France and Germany, was desperate for any tactical advantage that could help contain the German offensive and eventually resume the Allied advance toward the Rhine. The casualties from the Ardennes fighting were staggering, the loss rates among armored units particularly severe. He ordered a formal evaluation of the camouflage method, assigning officers from the Army's engineering section and combat development section to assess its effectiveness through controlled observation. The formal evaluation took place over 3 days in late January, during a period of relative quiet as both sides recovered from the brutal fighting and prepared for renewed operations. Engineers and tactical analysts established observation posts at various distances and under different lighting conditions, comparing treated Shermans against untreated vehicles to measure visibility and detection times with scientific precision. They used experienced observers who knew exactly what to look for, eliminated as many variables as possible, and conducted repeated trials to ensure statistical validity. The results were conclusive and striking. Washington's camouflage technique reduced detection range by 30 to 40% under winter conditions, and even experienced observers took significantly longer to identify treated vehicles compared to standard olive-green Shermans. The advantage was smaller at very close ranges, where size and sound mattered more than visual signature. But at ranges between 300 and 800 meters, the camouflage provided consistent and measurable benefit. The official report emphasized several key points that made the technique particularly valuable. First, it required absolutely no specialized materials or equipment. Everything needed was readily available in the operational area. Second, it could be applied by crew members without any technical training beyond basic instruction, making it accessible to every unit. Third, maintenance required only periodic reapplication that crews could handle themselves without support from higher echelons. Fourth, the effectiveness varied somewhat by terrain and season, but in every tested environment, the treated vehicles were measurably harder to detect than untreated ones. Finally, and perhaps most importantly from a command perspective, the technique noticeably improved crew morale by giving soldiers a sense of agency and control over their survival. Men who felt they were taking active steps to protect themselves fought better and maintained discipline more effectively than men who felt helpless and fatalistic. Bradley approved the technique for widespread use throughout his command, though implementation remained deliberately unofficial and decentralized because of concerns about bureaucratic resistance and regulatory complications. There was no formal training program established, no technical manual published, no official supply chain created for materials that did not need supplying. Instead, Information and instruction spread through the informal networks that connected frontline units, the same soldier-to-soldier communication channels that had always carried practical knowledge more effectively than official channels ever could. Crews taught other crews the application method and shared tips for gathering the best materials. Soldiers exchanged ideas for variations and improvements tailored to specific environments. Gradually, over the course of weeks, the practice became common and accepted throughout American armored units fighting in Northern Europe. Adopted not because someone ordered it, but because it worked and soldiers recognized its value. Washington found himself in an unusual and somewhat uncomfortable position as the originator of this widespread innovation. He was still officially just a private, still technically just the loader on a single tank crew among thousands. But he was also the person who had developed a technique being used by countless soldiers across multiple divisions, an innovation that was saving American lives every single day in ways that could never be fully quantified. Officers from other units sought him out for advice on application methods and material selection. War correspondents wanted to interview him for human interest stories about American ingenuity. Other African American soldiers, the relatively few serving in integrated or semi-integrated units, pointed to his contribution as powerful evidence of capability and worth that contradicted the racial prejudices that shaped military policy in American society. The recognition was deeply uncomfortable for Washington in many ways that he struggled to articulate. He had not developed the camouflage technique to become famous or prove anything about his race or challenge social hierarchies. He had simply applied knowledge from his childhood, methods his family had used to survive in an environment where being too visible often meant being exploited. The fact that soil mixing skills learned on a Mississippi sharecropper's farm could save lives in a European conflict seemed bizarre and almost absurd, but it also revealed something profound about the nature of useful knowledge and where it could be found. Intelligence and practical wisdom were not limited to people with formal education or prestigious backgrounds. Survival skills developed in response to oppression and injustice could be adapted to entirely different contexts and prove valuable in ways no one anticipated. Sullivan, who had been the most openly skeptical crew member about Washington's presence when the integration first occurred, became perhaps his strongest and most vocal advocate. The Boston Irishman had grown up with his own set of prejudices and assumptions, ideas about racial hierarchy and natural capabilities that seemed as obvious and natural as gravity. His family and community had taught him certain things about different groups of people, lessons that shaped how he saw the world and his place in it. But fighting alongside Washington for months, depending daily on his competence and quick thinking for survival, had slowly but inexorably eroded those comfortable beliefs. When someone in another unit made a dismissive comment about Negro soldiers or questioned their fighting ability, Sullivan's response was immediate, heated, and left no room for debate. He did not care about abstract politics or social theory. He cared that Washington had kept him alive through situations that killed better equipped and more fortunate men. He cared that the private's intelligence and battlefield skill had given their crew advantages that made the difference between survival and death countless times. That was the only measure that mattered. The winter fighting continued through January and into February, with undiminished intensity and violence. The German offensive that had threatened to split Allied forces and capture critical supply depots eventually stalled under the weight of American reinforcements and supply difficulties. The advance faltered, stopped, and then reversed as German units ran out of fuel and ammunition, while American strength continued to build. The Tiger tanks and King Tigers that had seemed so terrifyingly invincible during the early days of the counteroffensive were gradually worn down through simple attrition, through mechanical breakdowns that could not be repaired, through fuel shortages that left them immobile, and through the cumulative effect of thousands of small tactical advantages like the one Washington's camouflage technique provided. German technical superiority meant nothing when tanks sat disabled for lack of spare parts or abandoned for lack of fuel to move them. By March, Allied forces were advancing again with renewed momentum, crossing the Rhine River in multiple locations and driving deep into German territory against crumbling resistance. The character of combat changed dramatically as German resistance became increasingly desperate and fragmented, individual units fighting on because they had nowhere to retreat and no alternative except surrender or death. Hayes's crew fought through these final months of the conflict, still using Washington's camouflage technique, though adapted now for spring conditions, less white and grey, more brown and green as vegetation returned and winter's snow melted into mud. They were advancing through a small German town in early April when they encountered a group of abandoned German vehicles that included a Tiger tank sitting motionless in a village square. The massive machine had been disabled by mechanical failure rather than combat damage, left behind when its crew could not repair it and had no fuel to tow it. The crew stopped to examine this vehicle that had caused them so much fear and respect, wanting to see up close the machine that had dominated their nightmares and tactical planning for so many months. Standing next to the Tiger, Hayes was struck powerfully by how absolutely enormous it was compared to their Sherman, how impossibly thick the armor appeared when you could touch it with your hands, how large and intimidating the main gun looked from this perspective. The technical specifications he had memorized long ago suddenly became real and tangible in a way that numbers alone could never adequately convey. This was what they had been fighting against, this overwhelming combination of size and protection and firepower. Washington climbed up onto the Tiger's hull with the curiosity of someone examining an opponent they had finally defeated, running his hands over the armor's surface and peering into the interior through the open hatches. He commented thoughtfully that it was genuinely impressive engineering but also wasteful in its way, a statement that surprised Hayes with its insight. The Germans had built a nearly perfect tank, Washington explained, but they could not build enough of them to matter strategically. They had chosen quality over quantity, creating weapons that were superior individually, but insufficient collectively. The Americans had chosen the opposite approach, adequate weapons built in such overwhelming numbers that losses could be replaced faster than they could be inflicted. Neither approach was obviously superior in some absolute sense, but history would ultimately be written by whichever philosophy prevailed, and American factories had proven capable of outproducing German industry by margins that made technical superiority increasingly irrelevant. Hayes considered this observation carefully while standing in the shadow of this massive German tank. He thought about the thousands upon thousands of Shermans produced in American factories, the vast industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than German guns could destroy them. He also thought with deep feeling about the individual men inside those adequate tanks, the crews who faced superior German weapons daily with vehicles they knew were outmatched on every technical specification, the strategic wisdom of the production choice, the cold calculation that made perfect sense at industrial and strategic levels, did not make it any easier to be the individual soldier betting his life on adequate equipment. Those strategic calculations were written in the lives of men who burned to death in tanks that could not match their opponents, men whose deaths were accepted and planned for as necessary costs of eventual victory. But Washington's camouflage had changed that brutal equation slightly, but significantly. It had given Sherman crews a tactical advantage that partially offset their technical disadvantage, made survival moderately more likely without requiring any change to production schedules or logistics networks or industrial infrastructure. And it had cost absolutely nothing except the willingness to listen to an idea that came from an unexpected source, from someone outside the normal channels where military innovation was supposed to originate. That willingness to listen, that openness to knowledge from unconventional sources, had saved lives in ways that could never be fully quantified or measured. The conflict in Europe ended in early May with German surrender, the formal capitulation of German forces ending years of warfare that had consumed a continent and killed tens of millions. Hayes's crew survived the entire campaign from Normandy beaches to central Germany, an increasingly rare accomplishment for frontline armored units that had borne the heaviest casualties. They had been extraordinarily lucky in many ways, benefiting from favorable positioning and fortunate circumstances, but they had also been smart and adaptive, willing to innovate and learn rather than blindly following doctrine that did not match battlefield reality. In the chaotic weeks after surrender, as units processed enormous numbers of German prisoners and began the complex preparations for redeployment or occupation duty, Hayes learned through official channels that Washington was being considered for a Bronze Star in recognition of his contribution to American armored tactics. The recommendation had been initiated by Mitchell, enthusiastically supported by detailed testimony from dozens of other tank commanders, whose crews had adopted the camouflage technique and credited it with saving lives. The award would recognize not just the technical innovation itself, but the broader impact it had on morale and combat effectiveness across entire divisions. The decoration ceremony took place in June in a small French town that had been liberated months earlier, a modest affair with minimal fanfare or attention. Washington received his Bronze Star from a colonel who admitted quite frankly that he had been deeply skeptical of the technique when first hearing about it, had dismissed it as desperate improvisation that could not possibly be effective. But evidence and battlefield results could not be argued with or dismissed, he said. The official citation praised Washington's initiative and practical ingenuity, noting that his methods had been adopted throughout the American armored forces in the European theater and had contributed measurably to mission success and force preservation. Standing rigidly at attention while the medal was pinned to his uniform, Washington felt a complex mixture of pride and profound discomfort that he could not fully sort out. He was genuinely proud of what he had accomplished, proud that he had helped save American lives and contributed to victory in ways that mattered. But he was also painfully aware that this military recognition existed in a very specific context, that it would not necessarily translate to respect or opportunity or fair treatment when he returned to Mississippi and civilian life. The army that had allowed him to contribute and be recognized for his intelligence remained officially segregated, divided by racial policies that reflected broader American society. And the country he had fought for, the nation whose survival and victory he had helped secure, maintained legal systems of racial hierarchy and oppression that would not be impressed by a Bronze Star or moved by his service record. Hayes, watching the ceremony from his position in the formation, found himself thinking deeply about knowledge and where it actually comes from, about the assumptions that shape what people recognize as valuable or legitimate. He had been extensively trained by the army, educated in the technical specifications of armored warfare, taught the doctrine that was supposed to guide all his tactical decisions. All of that formal training had genuine value and had kept him alive in many situations, but it had not prepared him adequately for the reality of facing tiger tanks in winter forests, had not provided solutions to the problems that actually determined survival. Washington's knowledge, gained from a childhood spent hiding vegetables from exploitative landowners in Mississippi, had proven more immediately useful and practically valuable than anything Hayes had learned at Fort Knox or in any Army technical school. This realization troubled Hayes in ways he struggled to fully articulate or understand. It suggested powerfully that the military, for all its technical sophistication and vast institutional knowledge, remained systematically blind to wisdom that existed outside its formal structures and official channels. How many other soldiers throughout the army and throughout history had possessed useful knowledge that was never recognized or utilized because it came from backgrounds the military institution considered irrelevant or inferior? How much potential advantage and capability was routinely lost because officers and institutions assumed that valuable ideas only came from expected sources, from people with the right credentials and proper backgrounds? The questions had no easy answers, but demanded consideration. Sullivan, characteristically blunt and direct as always, expressed this realization more simply in his own words. He told Washington privately after the ceremony that he had been a complete idiot about many things, that he had believed incredibly stupid ideas about who was intelligent and who was not, about which people deserved respect and which did not. Fighting alongside someone day after day tended to clarify thinking dramatically, he said, burned away comfortable assumptions that could not survive sustained contact with battlefield reality. He was not sure what life would be like back in Boston, whether he could adequately explain to friends and family how combat had fundamentally changed his perspective on race and capability, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would remember Washington's contribution, would remember for the rest of his life that survival had depended on being smart enough to listen to good ideas regardless of where they came from or who proposed them. The crew eventually separated and went their different ways, sent to various redeployment centers based on their home locations, and accumulated point totals that determined eligibility for discharge. They exchanged addresses and promised sincerely to stay in touch, to visit each other after returning home and resuming civilian lives. But everyone understood that such promises were difficult to keep in practice. The intensity of shared combat experience did not automatically translate into lasting connection once the extraordinary circumstances that forged those bonds had ended and normal life resumed. Washington returned to Mississippi in August of 1945, taking a segregated train south through a country that was celebrating total victory, while simultaneously maintaining the racial segregation and discrimination that had shaped his entire life. He carried his Bronze Star and his honorable discharge papers in a folder, official documentation of service and recognition that should have meant something. But he discovered quickly and painfully that these meant very little in the world he had left 3 years earlier. The landowner's overseer did not care about military decorations or combat experience. Potential employers in town saw his skin color before noticing his service record. The technical knowledge he had gained, the experience of leading innovation in an armored unit that spread across an entire theater of operations, found absolutely no application in an economy that offered black men mainly agricultural labor or service positions with minimal pay and no prospects for advancement. Hayes, returning to his home in Ohio, found civilian life strange and deeply disconnected from his combat experiences. People constantly asked about the conflict, wanted to hear dramatic stories about combat and victory and American triumph, but they clearly did not want to hear about the complexity and moral ambiguity, about the times when survival depended on hiding and concealment rather than bold combat, about how a sharecropper's knowledge of mud and clay had proven more valuable than formal military training. The culture wanted a simple narrative of American triumph and inevitable victory, not a complicated story about learning from unexpected sources and the costs of technical inferiority. He wrote letters to Washington regularly, maintaining contact despite the difficulty and expense of correspondence. The letters revealed starkly how different their post-conflict experiences were, despite having shared so much during the most intense period of both their lives. Hayes had used the GI Bill to attend university, studying engineering with the ultimate goal of working in the rapidly expanding automotive industry. Washington had returned to agricultural labor in Mississippi, unable to access similar educational opportunities due to deliberate local resistance and severely limited economic resources. The dramatic divergence of their paths highlighted painfully how military service, which had briefly placed them on relatively equal footing, could not overcome or eliminate the structural inequalities that fundamentally shaped American society. Years passed with the steady accumulation of ordinary time. Hayes graduated from university, found good work at a manufacturing company, married and started a family that gave his life new meaning and purpose. But he remained troubled by the disconnect between wartime experience and peacetime society, by the way Washington's battlefield contribution had been recognized and celebrated in combat, but seemed to count for absolutely nothing in civilian life. He wrote detailed letters to military historians at various institutions, trying earnestly to ensure that Washington's innovation was properly recorded and remembered for future generations. Some historians ignored him completely. Others showed polite interest, but ultimately did nothing substantive with the information. The official histories being compiled by the Army focused almost exclusively on major battles and strategic decisions made by senior officers, not on the small tactical adaptations that had actually determined so many individual outcomes and saved so many individual lives. It was not until the 1960s, when both the civil rights movement and military scholarship were changing dramatically, that Washington's contribution started receiving the broader recognition it deserved. Historians studying the Ardennes Offensive and the brutal winter fighting of 1944 and 1945 began systematically documenting the camouflage techniques American crews had developed through field experimentation. Washington's name appeared in scholarly articles and eventually in published books, identified clearly as the originator of methods that had become widespread throughout American armored units and measurably improved survivability. The recognition came late, arriving only after Washington had spent 2 full decades working in relative obscurity and poverty, but it was genuine and meaningful when it finally came. Military analysts working from archival records confirmed definitively that the camouflage techniques had measurably improved American tank survivability during the winter campaign by margins that translated into hundreds of lives saved. The innovation had spread through informal soldier-to-soldier networks because it demonstrably worked, because frontline troops recognized its practical value immediately and adopted it without waiting for official approval or formal mandates from higher command. In some important ways, this bottom-up organic adoption was more impressive than if the technique had been formally mandated through official channels. It represented genuine recognition of effectiveness by the people whose lives directly depended on having every possible tactical advantage. Washington himself remained characteristically modest about his contribution when finally interviewed by military historians during the 1970s. He consistently emphasized that he had simply applied knowledge from his difficult upbringing, that he had not invented anything fundamentally new, but rather had adapted existing techniques to a different context where they proved valuable. He generously credited his family and community for teaching him to observe carefully, to understand subtle relationships between color and contrast, to think creatively and practically about solving problems with available resources. The sharecropper's life had been difficult and fundamentally unjust, he acknowledged freely, but it had also taught valuable skills and provided unique perspectives that formal education typically did not provide. Hayes, in his own interviews with historians during the same period, emphasized strongly how the military's rigid institutional structure had almost prevented Washington's innovation from being adopted and disseminated. If not for the desperate circumstances of the German offensive and field commanders willing to overlook regulations and unofficial procedures, the camouflage technique might never have been attempted or proven effective. The broader implication was clear and troubling. Rigid hierarchies and formal procedures that defined military organization could systematically exclude valuable knowledge if it came from unexpected sources or through unconventional channels. The military's post-conflict reforms, which had eventually included racial desegregation and broader recruitment from previously excluded populations, were important steps toward addressing this fundamental limitation. But institutional culture changed slowly and incompletely, often requiring generations to truly transform. The historical significance of Washington's contribution extended well beyond narrow questions of tactical effectiveness or technical innovation. It represented a rare moment when the military's racial barriers became temporarily more permeable, when desperate practical need temporarily overrode prejudice and institutional inertia. The innovation succeeded and spread because it worked undeniably well, but its adoption and dissemination required officers like Mitchell and Hayes to demonstrate openness to ideas from subordinates, especially subordinates whose background and race made their knowledge easy to dismiss or ignore, according to prevailing assumptions. This aspect of the historical story resonated particularly powerfully during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when activists and scholars actively sought examples of African American achievement and capability that directly contradicted segregationist ideology and racist assumptions. Washington's Bronze Star and the widespread adoption of his camouflage technique throughout an entire theater of operations served as compelling evidence that segregation systematically wasted human potential, that excluding people from full participation and opportunity based solely on race meant losing access to their knowledge, skills, and perspectives. The military's eventual complete desegregation, formalized by President Truman's executive order in 1948, but implemented only gradually over subsequent years through determined effort, reflected in part this hard-learned logic about capability and wasted potential. By the time Washington passed away in 1992, his wartime contribution had been thoroughly documented in professional military history and was regularly taught at service academies. His obituary appeared in major newspapers across the country, describing him accurately as a tactical innovator whose battlefield methods had saved countless American lives during the critical winter fighting of 1944 and 1945. The recognition was gratifying and meaningful, but also deeply poignant, arriving only near the end of a long life that had been fundamentally shaped and limited by segregation and discrimination, despite his proven capability and significant contributions. Hayes attended the funeral despite his own declining health, traveling to Mississippi one final time. He spoke briefly but emotionally at the service, describing Washington as one of the most genuinely intelligent and practically resourceful soldiers he had ever served with in 3 years of continuous combat, someone whose quick thinking and practical wisdom had kept their entire crew alive through situations that killed so many others. He emphasized with conviction that Washington's contribution should be remembered not merely as an interesting tactical innovation, but as powerful evidence of what becomes possible when institutions are finally willing to recognize merit and capability, regardless of their source or the identity of who proposes them. The story of Washington's field camouflage technique continued to be taught at military academies and armor schools for decades, used consistently as an example of successful field innovation and adaptive tactical thinking. Instructors emphasized several important lessons that extended beyond the specific technical details: the critical importance of listening carefully to enlisted soldiers' ideas and observations, the practical value of local knowledge and unconventional thinking, the absolute need to adapt established doctrine to actual battlefield conditions rather than blindly following procedures that did not match reality. The specific technical details of Washington's mud and ash technique were acknowledged as less important than the broader principle it so clearly illustrated, that valuable innovation could come from absolutely anywhere, and that organizational success required cultivating genuine openness to unexpected sources of useful knowledge. In the subsequent decades, military historians continued examining and re-examining the brutal winter fighting of 1944 and 1945, analyzing through increasingly sophisticated methods how American forces had ultimately overcome significant technical disadvantages to achieve victory. Washington's camouflage technique was consistently identified as one factor among many complex variables, a small tactical advantage that contributed meaningfully to larger operational success. Individually, no single tactical innovation or adaptation was truly decisive. Collectively, however, hundreds of small improvements and adaptations accumulated into meaningful cumulative advantage that affected outcomes. This evolving understanding represented a significant shift in how military history was researched, written, and understood by both scholars and practitioners. Earlier historical accounts had focused almost exclusively on major battles, strategic decisions made by senior commanders, and prominent military and political leaders. Later scholarship paid much more attention to the actual experiences of ordinary soldiers, the small innovations that spread through informal networks, the countless ways that frontline troops adapted creatively to circumstances that higher commanders and strategic planners had not anticipated or adequately prepared them for. Washington's story fit this pattern perfectly. An enlisted soldier whose practical knowledge led directly to innovation that formal military institutions had completely failed to develop through their own processes. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.